Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. Today's video is the third entry in my squad showcase series, where I take a look at your teams with a specific element or focus in mind. Now today's video is all about the water element, and thank you so much to everyone who submitted your teams, with the submission period ending back on December 22nd. I really appreciate you waiting patiently as I work to get out this video. I actually was really overwhelmed by the amount of participation this time, because for the first two squad showcases, I only had around 30 teams submitted, and this time we got 60, so double the amount. That does mean I am approaching it a little bit differently today, because as I sat down to record this a number of times, what I found was I was kind of repeating the same feedback over and over for teams that were fairly similar. So what I decided to do today is we're going to start off like normal, look at the pool of water characters as a whole, discuss that for a few minutes, then we're going to get into your teams, but they're split up by the type of feedback I have. So whether it's about your team composition and who your leader is, whether it's about your dragons, whether it's about your Wyrmprints, or if I just think your team is pretty much good as it is. And finally, after that, I've saved all the teams, all the submissions where you actually asked a specific question for the end, and that's going to be like a Q&A where I'll answer those questions directly. So if you didn't ask a question in your comment, just be informed that I am just going to show off your team without the comment this time, because there are just so many, and I think this is going to make it more digestible. But in the future, if you have a specific question, I would be able to include it in that Q&A part. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it, starting with the pool of water adventurers. So the big thing with water as an element is that there are two primary ailment resistances. One is to stun, and there are a total of 8 characters who have stun res as their primary resistance. And the second resistance is to burn, and there are 9 characters who resist burn. Now Elizanne is kind of unique in that she has 50% burn res and then some stun res if you promote her to a 5-star. And Pietro is also unique because even though he's a water unit, he has blindness res, which is a condition most commonly inflicted by light enemies. So looking at the pool as a whole, burn res is definitely more common. However, there's actually a fairly small number of characters who get burn res that goes up to 100%. So you're only looking at Xainfried, Lily, Thaniel, Winter Nefaria, and Orsum in that pool, and the others can't quite reach that 100%, with Elisanne and Celiera only being able to reach 50, and Wake, Rex, and Zardan only being able to reach 75. Now in terms of the types of content you'd bring these characters to, for the Dragon Trials, facing off against Brunhilde, that's where you'll likely want to use your burn res characters. And for Imperial Onslaught, the Flame map has purple AoE attacks that inflict stun, so that's where you'd want to use those stun res characters. Now the other piece of content that we've gotten fairly recently, still less than a month old, is High Brunhilde, of course, and High Brunhilde inflicts burn with an actually 200% rate. So a lot of people have preferred to go into that challenge with characters with 100% burn res. It is possible it has been done with other types of characters, utilizing skills that provide shields in particular, so be aware of that if that's something you're taking on. As for the event itself that prompted this call for your teams, the Miracle of Dragonule, this facility event kind of had a first in that most of the waves of enemies would inflict burning, and the boss itself could inflict burning too, but some of the boss's attacks inflicted stun. So this was one of the first times in an event where we've really seen an advantage to having a variety of affliction resistance potentially. And I think a lot of you took advantage of that by mixing up your team composition and having characters with both stun and burn res. Happy to see that most characters were used. And also, I was happy to see that a lot of you had promoted your favorite characters to 5-star, including some 3-star adventurers. So look out for those as we start to cycle through the teams, and that is what we're going to do now. So the first piece of feedback I have is specifically regarding choosing your leader versus the rest of the members of your team. And I'm assuming that for the most part you will control your leader and not necessarily switch characters a lot during a match. And because of that, there are certain things that the leader is going to be able to do that your AI-controlled characters are not going to be able to do as effectively or at all. So one thing is, whoever your leader is, you're going to be able to actively play and actively dodge with. And so for that reason, I think it's a little bit less risky to have off types of affliction resistance on your leader, because they're the one you're controlling, they're the one you can dodge with more easily. So I think that a lot of you had Dragalia Cleo or another Sunrise character as your leader, and I think that actually works out in the context of the event pretty well, because being your lead character, you can dodge with them more easily, avoid that burn that prevails for the majority of the match. Many of you would also bring Thaniel as a backup in case you did get burned. But the other big thing I think you need to think about a little bit is your AI characters won't use their force strikes. So this was something I saw a lot with this event because the new characters, Dragalia Xander and Dragalia Nefaria, both had skills or abilities that depended on them using their force strikes. So in Nefaria's case, her second skill created some gifts that could be distributed with force strikes to provide energy to other characters. And for Dragalia Xander, he had Striker's Energy, where you want to be defeating enemies with force strikes to build up energy through that ability. So I think part of it is you can get by with a lot of different team compositions. I'm not saying that you need to get every edge and avoid using force strike related things in your AI at all, because there's still merit to these characters even when they're not able to utilize their kits fully. But that is one thing I saw that is a really common theme on all the teams that I'm including in this part of the video. Basically for these teams, the main piece of feedback I would have to you is think a little bit about who your leader is versus the rest of your teammates. One thing I liked to see was Xander as a leader as well. Because Xander has stun res, he applies in that same category I talked about earlier as someone you can dodge with proactively when they're your leader, but also because he has that striker's strength and depends on using force strikes to beat up the waves of enemies and make himself stronger. So that is something to consider. Once again, it's not an end-all decision or anything like that. It's not absolutely necessary, and I know a lot of you probably set up your teams this way with these holiday characters just to get into the spirit of the event. But if you wanted to push them even further, that is something I would think about, especially if there's only one character on your team who utilizes force strikes. Now, for the positive on many of these teams, I did see that a lot of you had Elisan on your team, or Zainfried, or a healer, and I think all these types of characters are excellent to round out your team as AI, because the AI is really good at casting skills as soon as they are relevant. So for Elisan or Zainfried, they're going to cast their buff skill as soon as it's active. For your healers, they're going to wait and cast their heals as soon as they're able to help someone on your team. So overall, really happy with this set of submissions, but all of these had that one thing in common. That's why I've shown off these teams together of maybe the leader and AI choice could be perfected slightly, where you're putting that leader as the character who needs to dodge the most, or as the character who utilizes their force strikes the most. At the end of the day though, it could just be the character you want to control the most and like to play as. So as always, don't let that be a sticking point and take this with a grain of salt. From there, the next thing I want to talk about is dragon selection. So this relates to the previous point in the sense that sometimes you do want to protect your vulnerable AI characters by giving them a more defense-oriented dragon. That is one approach. The other approach is to play up the innate strengths of each character. So flipping through some of these teams that fit into this feedback category of work on your dragons a little bit, we see things like putting HP dragons on attackers. And if those are the only dragons you have available, I think that that's somewhat reasonable. If they have that same element bonus, it's quite possible you're getting the most stats out of those dragons. And for especially vulnerable attackers like Celiera, maybe you just want that HP so they'll survive the challenge battle. But generally speaking, my slight preference is to pair characters with dragons who play to their inherent strengths. So for attackers, I do prefer dragons that provide even more strength. For tanks, I prefer strength or a mix of HP and strength. And for healers, I prefer HP. The other thing that some of you did was use off-element 5-star dragons. And it is possible, it's happened to me, where because you have them at such a high level, they just provide more raw stats than an on-element 3-star dragon. But what I would say is, probably the free story dragons, so in this case Mercury is the one that comes to mind, they probably would provide a decent amount of stats if you were willing to spin the dragon fruit and level them up, even compared to those 5-star dragons that you're using. So that is something just to check. Usually you want to align those because you get a same element attunement bonus. It's not always the case, but it is generally a good rule of thumb. And related to that, and one of the most common examples I saw was a lot of people were rocking Phoenix as an off-element dragon. And this is one of those things that's more of a question to you than a direct piece of feedback, because I just want to know, was using Phoenix in that way working out for you? Or did you still face some challenges with the event despite that? Because Phoenix honestly is powerful enough that I kind of see why you would want to do something like this. But if you are going to go that route, I would heavily consider just including a flame character on your team, because in this particular event, where you're facing off against flame enemies, that flame character that's rocking Phoenix, they're not going to be at an elemental disadvantage. So even if it was someone like Yuden, I think that might be a better carrier of Phoenix than one of your water adventurers. Just something to think about. Maybe you were already doing that, but just changed your team for the purpose of submission. Especially to those of you who had Phoenix and she wasn't on your leader, let me know, were you switching to that character just to use Phoenix? Because I see this example where someone had Cupid and Phoenix on the same team, and unless you're transforming once per battle into Cupid and then into Phoenix, or unless maybe these are really high level and they just give you a lot of stats, that particular composition doesn't make too much sense to me. Besides that, I won't provide too much extra feedback about which dragons to use. I know that your availability will vary a lot, so some of you who are in this section of the video, you even have no summon accounts, so that explains why you're using the free dragons. And for some of you, you have your own reasons. Maybe these are high level, maybe they're your favorite dragon or something, so I understand that. But generally speaking, my inclination is for a healer, you want to use a same element HP boosting dragon. Once again, for a tank or a defense unit, you want to use a strength or a mix of HP and strength, with HP being not a bad choice if that's all you have left. For your attacker, and especially if it's the attacker you're controlling, you want to use a strength dragon. And for support units, it's kind of like tanks. Lean towards strength if you have it. If you find they're dying often, you can always use a mix or use a pure HP dragon. All in all though, still cool to see the collection of dragons that some of you have. I really saw, for the most part, players were aligning their dragons pretty well. You know, it really depends on what is in the rest of your barracks, but I was pretty happy with how you guys did, and once again, these are really minor pieces of feedback. The level of quality on all of the teams this time around was very high, so that's why I've broken it up this way, just to provide that tiny marginal piece of feedback, since really, for the most part, a lot of these teams looked like they would have done just fine in the event. Okay, so the next segment I want to get into is to show off teams where I might tweak one or two things with the setup of your Wyrmprints. Now, Wyrmprints are one area where, practically speaking, for events like this, you are most likely going to be using those Wyrmprints that give you an extra bonus to your event rewards. That's kind of a reality with the way that events are set up right now. Hopefully in the future, if we are able to get that double Wyrmprint slot or 2 Wyrmprint slots, you'll have more customization options. But looking at the event Wyrmprints, one of them was a Wish Upon the Yule Tree. That is a 5-star that has a healing double buff ability. So one very small piece of feedback is, you want to make sure, if you can, that there's a way to actually utilize that on your team. So you want somebody who can provide a defense buff like Thaniel, or self-buff their own defense. So that is one I like to see, especially on characters that have that access to a defense buff. It's still a good Wyrmprint either way, and good for grinding out the event, of course. Other than that, some of you put the Saintly Delivery Wyrmprint on characters with 1 attacking skill, when you had the option to put it on characters who had 2 attacking skills. So I think that's a pretty easy switch to make. Generally speaking, I would have used the free Wyrmprint from the event, A Slice of Dragalia, on characters who had 1 attack and 1 buff, and use something like Saintly Delivery with its skill damage on characters who had 2 attacks. Now, sometimes it's the case that your skill damage print is just at the highest level among what you have, and so maybe even if the character it's equipped to can't utilize it fully, you're still equipping it just for the stats alone, and that makes sense to me. I definitely see why some of you might want to do that. So if, for instance, you put Plunder Pals or Saintly Delivery on your Zanefried, and that is just what you had, I can sort of get that as well. Another observation I had here was with Gale of Beauty. So Gale of Beauty, I just want to recommend you equip to your leader. This kind of intersects with the feedback from the first part of the video, because if not your leader, Gale of Beauty, that extra dragon time, you want that on whichever character you're actually transforming into the dragon and using the dragon. So of course, generally speaking, for healers, you want Wyrmprints that provide recovery potency. For attackers with multiple attacking skills, you want Wyrmprints that provide skill damage or provide strength, maybe something like Broken Punisher or something like Critical Rate. And then for those characters that are kind of in between, this is where I most like to see a Slice of Dragalia. So in many cases, a lot of you in this section of the video, you had great Wyrmprints equipped to your characters. It just looked like you could move 1 or 2 things around, like swap a skill damage Wyrmprint onto an attacker, and swap a skill prep Wyrmprint onto a healer or a mixed-use character, and that would improve your team quite a bit. One other very small piece of feedback I would give is, if your character is ranged, they are a little bit better user, in my opinion, of Wyrmprints that rely on maintaining a high or full HP than if they are close range. Again, all of these are the smallest of suggestions. So many of these teams look good. So many of these teams look very powerful. So think of this as a take it or leave it piece of advice. As an example, a lot of you had a skill damage Wyrmprint on Celiera when you were also running Karina on your team. And in my view, with her 2 attacking skills, it just makes more sense to put that on Karina, because the first 2 skills, even if you have a weapon skill that does damage, the first 2 skills are the ones that charge the most quickly. Now, this is definitely a topic on which I'd be curious to hear your feedback. I haven't done a formal analysis of this, so it is possible that just having skill damage for that first skill is really good, and that's all you need. But especially when there's a character on your team where you could easily swap the Wyrmprints, I do feel it is a little bit of wasted potential. So without giving specific advice to everyone in this part of the video, look at your team, think about what you might want to swap around a little bit. If you still have a question about that, leave a comment below and I will respond to your question. Okay, and now we get into the teams where really I didn't have a lot of feedback to provide to you. Your Wyrmprints looked on point, your dragons looked on point, and your team composition, your arrangement, your leader, the 4-strike situation, everything seemed to be really well developed. So I just want to say great job on these teams. Of course, there's always room for improvement. There's always things that you can work on, like building out your mana circles, building out your facilities, leveling up your characters. But at the end of the day, that's not really what this series is about. It's more about the creativity behind what you're doing. It's not about just being at a high level and that making your team stronger. So I won't provide feedback on that. I would also add that many of the teams in this part of the video showcased a great deal of synergy in what they were doing. And not to say that the earlier teams didn't do that, because many of you did. Some of the synergies I like to see were stacking extra critical on Dragon Yule Cleo. Another one that really appealed to me was having Thaniel on the team with a Wish Upon the Yule Tree, or having a Wish Upon the Yule Tree on Karina and letting her trigger her own healing double buff. I also liked people that put Valiant Crown on Karina to give her that skill damage on both attacking skills, and with her 4-star axe or 4-star water axe, she could then buff her own defense to get both a healing and a strength double buff. That was really nice to see. Now, some of the teams in this category, you really just had the event Wyrmprint on everyone, but because of that skill prep, it's so universal, and I'm assuming you're doing that for grinding, that you can't really go too wrong with that. Another thing that really stood out to me, both in this section and among the previous teams, is anytime I saw the original Xander as a leader, I thought you were going to have a really great time in this facility event, because his ability to use Striker's Strength and just stack strength buffs was really high in this event because there's so many mobs of enemies. Alright, and that's pretty much all I have to say about your teams. Once again, just want to continue to reiterate, all of the teams that I got were great. It's more so that for this last set of teams, I just didn't have anything else to add onto what I already saw. So whether I provided feedback on your Wyrmprints, your dragons, your team composition and the use of AI, or really not a lot of feedback at all, good job to everybody who submitted. Now we're going to get into the Q&A where I look at those teams who specifically had questions and posted those in their comment. So first up, we have a team submitted by Chris, and Chris asks, who am I to doubt the power of the Child of Miracles? You can read Chris's full comment on the side there. And Chris, you narrowly snuck in with this because I'm pretty sure this is a rhetorical question, but I am going to look at everything you submitted because you gave me a ton of screenshots to work with. And that was another thing I found challenging this time around. A lot of people gave me a lot of screenshots with extra information, and it was just very difficult to condense all of that into a digestible format. But with that question mark on your submission, we are going to take a look at it. So I see that you have your 5-star Amane as your leader. She is max level, and you got a really nice screenshot where she is blinking. Pretty cute to see. There were a number of these throughout everyone's submissions. And I like that you have the weapon on Karina that can access her healing double buff. Overall, looking at the team, Amane will probably work as your leader because you're controlling her. You're able to dodge with her, especially since she's ranged. You're less at risk for just randomly taking damage. The rest of your team, though, one character with 50% burn res and then 2 characters with 100% stun res. I can imagine that might have been a little bit challenging. So let me know what your experience was like with that. The same comments I made earlier about your choice of Wyrmprints apply. So I really wouldn't change anything if you're just going to use straight skill prep. And use the greatest gift Wyrmprints for extra player EXP. For dragons, I would probably put Jean on Cleo, Vojanoi on Celiera, and Poliahu on Karina. And your best light dragon, probably one that provides strength if you have one, onto your Amane. And the next person who submitted a question was Knight1725, and Knight asked, what should I do about the stage boss? I can't survive past the 4th wave. So Knight, I saw you a lot around the Discord. I hope that you were able to get past the 4th wave eventually. I know I see you a lot in the comment section. So I hope you answered my call when I said to ask for feedback directly, because it was going to take a while to get this video out. But as for your team, I would mainly advise making some adjustments and rearranging some of your characters. So I do like that you have Nefaria as your leader. If you're controlling her, you can take advantage of her second skill, Elisan and Ricard are both good at doing their job when they're controlled by the AI because they provide buffs and heal respectively, but you should probably switch the dragons on Ricard and Elisan because Ricard really wants extra HP to be able to heal for more, and Poliahu is going to give a little bit more of that. Whereas Elisan can kind of go either way, but will take the strength from Vojanoi. Now you are running both Sibella and Elisan, meaning you're losing out on a co-ability. So if survival is your concern, you could bring in someone with a defense co-ability like Rex or potentially Pietro, although Pietro's blindness res won't help you too much out on this challenge, or wouldn't have on this challenge. Besides that, the Wyrmprint that's on Sibella, not really going to do a whole lot for you. That Wyrmprint provides resistance to wind, and the enemies in this event did flame damage. So looking at the other Wyrmprints you have access to, frankly just using a skill prep Wyrmprint would be pretty good, would probably be a little bit better, or using your greatest gift Wyrmprint if you want to get more player experience. Besides that, I noticed that you have Mercury as well as a dragon, so that is another option for your Ricard instead of switching over Poliahu. And when it came to the fourth wave of the challenge battle, the main tip I have is that is the point where you want to use your helper skill to take out a lot of enemies, or become a dragon and take out a lot of enemies, and then build your dragon gauge back up to utilize one more time against the actual boss itself. So hopefully just by leveling up your facility to level 30, that was enough for you to clear out the event. Definitely let me know in the comments below. The next question I got was from Mashiki, and Mashiki said, even though I managed to clear the 100-second title, I'm still not sure in my Wyrmprint choice. I want to know what the best options are from what I have. So looking at your team, Mashiki, it looks like you have a really solid team. I would probably lead with Xander, but it could just be comfort and familiarity while you're playing Lily, or maybe you prefer a ranged character. Xander, of course, being in the lead, he can utilize his striker's strength and utilize that extra 4-strike damage he has. But frankly speaking, your Wyrmprints are all very powerful. All 3 of these characters have 2 attacking skills in your lead, and so the skill damage on both Lily and on Xander is very welcome. I would maybe consider putting Resounding Rendition even onto Cleo because she likes both skill damage and interacts with critical, but of course Levin's champion makes a lot of sense on her too, just like that Dragonule Jeanne d'Arc does. Looking at the rest of your Wyrmprints, the only thing I would consider from the rest of your Wyrmprints is one with the shadows, and it really just comes down to how much stats that provides. Because if you're getting more out of that than Levin's champion, it might not be a bad thing to consider swapping out. But overall, really powerful team. Okay, so the next question I had was from Rollip, and Rollip said they cleared the challenge battle and got the epithet. However, they want to know if this team needs improvement since they barely cleared it with a healer as a helper. Should I switch someone out? Also, I'm not sure if I'm giving everyone the right Wyrmprints or dragons. So looking at your team, pretty strong. I like that you have Xander in your lead once again. Lily's Wyrmprint I think makes a lot of sense on her. I might actually consider switching Vojanoi over to Lily, since Celiera with her low HP, she might want that Poliahu to better survive compared to Lily. One thing about the Wyrmprint on Celiera is it'd be nice if she could buff her own defense to utilize that. So I might actually swap that Wyrmprint over to Lily and potentially move Crystallian Envoy to Celiera even though she's a close range character. The extra flame res might also help protect her from dying. Besides that, you could consider putting Resounding Rendition onto Xander, and Evening of Luxury, maybe put on Elisan, or maybe just use one of the event Wyrmprints on Elisan instead. With his 2 attacking skills and being a melee fighter, I think that Xander is going to have a hard time keeping full HP, yet he appreciates the extra skill damage from Resounding Rendition a lot. Even looking at the rest of your Wyrmprints, I don't think I would necessarily make too many changes there. And as for the other characters in your barracks, I think you've done a good job here. The one swap you could consider making would be potentially to bring in Ricard, although he has stun res, instead of Celiera because Ricard functions pretty capably on his own, And your Xander and Lily are going to do enough damage, I would think, on this team. You could also bring in Luther, but I think that Luther's role is already pretty well fulfilled on your team with your other attackers. And Luther has stun res to top things off. But overall, this looks like a pretty solid team. I like that your leader is your character with your off resistance. The other characters on your team all seem to have a pretty good role to play. It kind of makes sense that lacking a healer on your team, you would need a healer as your support or your helper. And there is no shame in that. That is a good strategy to bring up, and it's a strategy I've often used to get my deathless clears. Alright, and the final submission comes from Art, and Art is asking about who the better healer is in the long term when comparing Ricard and Thaniel. So they also provide some nice detail about which Wyrmprints they use for farming the event versus the challenge battle. And I actually think that your challenge battle setup also makes a lot of sense, with that skill prep being pretty good on Xainfried, so he can get out his offensive buff to the team more quickly. Overall, when it comes to Ricard versus Thaniel, it turns out that Thaniel has been almost essential for the vast majority of High Brunhilde clears, but Ricard has been made to work. Ricard can work if someone is able to shield him from the burn that is a big threat, and his full HP equals defense means that he takes less damage from the huge initial hit that High Brunhilde unleashes. So I think that he requires a similar amount of investment to be able to use, and you'll probably have a harder time with him if you're going into public lobbies and trying to find a match, because you're going to need someone like Dragalia Nefaria, or Pietro, or potentially Sabella, that can actually provide a shield to him so that he just doesn't burn to death in that match. For that reason, I would say that Thaniel is a safer investment at this point, because most teams are going to want and need a Thaniel, but Ricard does have 2 healing skills, which is pretty good, and with the 4-star Beauty's Balm, or the Water Elemental version, he actually gets up to a 3rd heal. Of course, now that it's after the fact, I've actually released an entire spotlight video on Ricard, so check that out if you want more information. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the video for today. Let me know what you thought about this format. I once again apologize for the delay in getting this video out to you. With that facility event happening right around Christmas and only having one weekend when it took place, I wasn't able to do it during the duration of the event. And in the end, it ended up taking quite a bit longer than that with the amount of teams that were submitted. In the future, I do want to modify the format and give everyone a little bit more spotlight, but instead of picking out random people today, I decided this would be the fairest way to do things, to split up everyone into different categories of the type of feedback so I didn't repeat myself as much, and then to have those people who actually had a specific question get their question answered. So moving forward, as a preview of what I want to do with this series, what I am thinking is, for the next raid event, and hopefully it's an element we haven't done, I would like to make this something that's live, because the raid is the one time where you can see a full team of 4 by other players. Normally, even if someone's on your friend list or sends you a friend request, you can only see their helper unit and view the stats of that. But in a raid, you can actually view someone's entire team at once. So ideally, that would be the direction I want to go with this. Of course, I still have to figure out live streaming and how that would all work, when I would do that, what the time would be. And this last raid was such a grind with Shishimai that I didn't think that was the right time to do so, so we're going to get back to Shadow eventually. And of course, I needed to get this out first. But as always, I appreciate your support. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it to this part of the video. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.